We've been studying Leviticus for the last several weeks. And last week we got to Leviticus 16. Leviticus 16 is talking about the Day of Atonement. And we've been looking at the book of Leviticus from a standpoint of the children of Israel saying, how do we live with a perfect God in our midst? And the background is they've spent 400 years in Egypt. They've gotten their minds polluted about what, who, how God is because of the people that were around them. They still understood who God was. They prayed to him for deliverance from Egypt. And these are the people that saw him devastate Egypt. They left Egypt, and before they even got across the Red Sea, why did you bring us out here? And God kept showing them his power. And if that reminds you a little bit of the New Testament where Jesus kept showing that he was God and the power he had, that's a good correlation there. But they get over into the wilderness, they complain, they get punished. And so we're sitting here with the concept, they're afraid of God being in their midst, not because he's a capricious God, but because they know what he's going to do. He's predictable. So he gives them the laws of the sacrifices, the laws of holiness, and we see Leviticus is in the center of the Pentateuch. And in the middle of that is the chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. It's like everything leading up to here is leading to this day, and everything after it is kind of because of it. In fact, it was such a big deal to them that the Hebrew writers often would just say the day instead of the Day of Atonement. Everybody knew what they meant. It was the day. So that's kind of our background. At the end of the first year in the wilderness, they've been through a lot. And on the first day of the first month of the second year, they put the tabernacle together. They had all the parts made. They put it together. They spent a few weeks cleansing the tabernacle. Aaron and the Levites were cleansed, purified, and they set up worship. They spent the next 6 to 7 months figuring out that, I'm spending as much time unclean as I am clean. He gave them the law so they would know what food was clean and what was unclean, what they should do to make themselves clean. He gave them sacrifices so they could purify themselves. And in the process of all of this, God living in their midst, his tabernacle being in their midst, their uncleanness polluted the tabernacle. And that's what the sin offering was for, was to cleanse the tabernacle and the holy things in the tabernacle. We often think of the sin offering being for their sins, but the purpose of it was to cleanse or purify the tabernacle and the holy things in it. Now, it also says that the priest made atonement for them with this as well. So there is some ransom and purification both involved. So on the 10th day of the 7th month of the second year, we have the Day of Atonement. This is a big day for them. What do you think they did? We covered chapter 16 last week. Do you think they made preparation ahead of that day, or did they just wake up on the Day of Atonement and say, well, today's the day? No, we know some specific preparations that they probably made. One was they probably picked the animals for the sacrifices out ahead of time. Aaron had to bring a bull and a ram to purify his sin, to purify himself, the tabernacle, the bull for a sin offering or purification offering, and a ram as a whole burnt offering. Do you think that they just said, here's a good bull. He doesn't have any blemishes. Man, he picked the best one they had. He got it ready. They had it picked out. Ram the same way. Had to pick 2 goats and a ram for the children of Israel. Now think about all the children of Israel. How did they pick which ram and which goats they were going to offer? Don't know. But I doubt if it was, here's one, we're going to take this one. It was purposeful. On top of that, we know that someone was picked. We have no idea how. We don't know if it was a priest. We don't know if it was a Levite. We don't know who it was. But there was a person who was made in readiness to take the scapegoat out into the wilderness. I doubt very seriously if they waited till that day to say, you're going to take him out. That probably didn't happen. What did Aaron do the day before? You think we don't know. Just be blunt about it. But imagine in your mind, you're Aaron. You're getting ready to do this big thing tomorrow. You've been told you don't go into the Holy of Holies anytime you want to. You only go in once a year. And then only on a specific day. And you do specific things before you go in. You think he thought about that any the day before? Chapter 16 starts off with a reminder of Nadab and Abihu. Remember, those who draw near to me will sanctify me. I will be sanctified by those that draw near to me. It's a big deal. So what I want to do today is I want to try to draw a picture in your mind of what happened for the first 4 or 5 minutes here. So as we get here, we see Aaron do you remember what the Hebrews were supposed to do? What it says at the end of chapter 16? There's a phrase it uses. They were, according to some versions, supposed to humble themselves. Other versions say they were to afflict themselves. You think they got ready beforehand? Oh, by the way, this was a Sabbath. What did they do the day before a Sabbath, every Sabbath? They got 2 days of manna. Remember? So all of these things are going. This is not something that was come upon just, here's today. This was in preparation. They were ready for this. So the morning of the day of atonement, the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies was 10 cubits by 10 cubits. That's approximately 15 feet by 15 feet. A little bigger than this area up here, probably. The holy place was 15 feet by 30 feet. So realistically, the whole thing could probably sit in this room. If you take the courtyard included, the courtyard itself was 75 feet by 150 feet. Would easily fit on this lot here. Now, we often see pictures like this. This is the only slide you're going to see today. Shows the tabernacle and then all of the tribes around it. That's misleading to us. How many children of Israel were there? Approximately 2 million. How do we get this number? There were 600,000 men of fighting age, over 20, that were physically able to fight. 600,000. If you figure one woman for each one of those men, that's 1.2 million. If you think one child for each one of those, that's 1.8 million. The Hebrews weren't known for having one child. So easily 2 million. If you wanted to be really conservative, 1.5 million probably. Could have been more. That's a lot of people. Melbourne, 2020 census, 84,000. That's a lot of, wait a minute, that's not many people. Brevard County, 600,000. How many fighting men they had? So really what we should be seeing here is this little bitty thing with God in the center and this great troop of people outside. That's what we should be visualizing. So this is a little misleading. So with that in mind, what did these people do as the Day of Atonement passed? We don't know. But if you think about the things we do know about, what did they do when the law was read to them? They stood and listened. So we can kind of imagine that, okay, it's the Day of Atonement. We're humbling ourselves. Maybe we're fasting. We're standing around, everybody looking toward the center, whether you could see the tabernacle or not. They were reverent. That was the concept. And why? Because they knew the consequences. Because they were learning who God was. Yes, this is relevant to us today. Not because we have the same laws, because we need to learn God is living in us. And it's a big deal. So Aaron gets up. First thing he does, he bathes himself. He goes to the courtyard in the tabernacle. He bathes himself. He puts on the linen clothes. These are already ready. They're ready for him. He casts lots to select one of the two goats for the children of Israel. One that is going to be offered to Jehovah as a sin offering. One that is going to be sent out into the wilderness. The lots are cast. He then kills the bull that is for his sin offering. That is his sin offering to God. We don't know if he killed the bull and the goat that was offered to the Lord at the same time, but we know he did kill the bull, take the blood of the bull into the Holy of Holies, sprinkled it as he was told to, cleanse the things in the temple, and then the way it's worded, it seems that he did the same thing with the blood of the ram. So by this time, one of the goats, both the bull and the goat have been slaughtered. The tabernacle has been cleansed. He then takes the blood and sprinkles it on the laver, on the altar out in the courtyard. Now, he lays his hand on the second goat. He confesses the sins of the children of Israel. What are the children of Israel doing? They're sitting and watching. They may not be able to see, but they're humbling themselves. And then the one that is set in readiness, the one that has been appointed, takes the goat outside the camp. Now, if you visualize this, the Holy of Holies, the holy place, the tabernacle have been cleansed. It's like it's pointing outward, cleansing from the inside out. So the sins are taken outside the camp. Now Aaron goes back and washes again and changes his clothes. Those sins have been put so far away that he now cleanses himself again, and he offers on the altar the sin offering for himself and for his tribe, and the sin offering for the people. And the Bible also says that the fat, let me get this right. Yes, that's right. He offers the sin offering, but the fat of the burnt offering is also put on the altar at this time. After that, the leftovers are all taken outside of the camp, burned. The concept is we have cleansed the entire nation. After that, the person who took the scapegoat out washes himself, and then he's allowed back into the camp. Now, to help us see this a little bit better, with that picture in your mind, let's turn over to the book of Hebrews. Because Hebrews, the entire book, is really a comparison, saying the old law and the new law. This is so much better. If you wanted to use a one-word term for Hebrews, the word is better. And last week I said read chapter 10. Well, I got into it. I said, well, we need chapter 9. Well, we need chapter 8. We could spend a whole period looking at just this to understand Leviticus. But the thing about it is, we can see from these comparisons we can get a better understanding of what these laws meant to the Hebrews, and thus we have a better understanding of what Christ means to us. So we're going to look at chapter 8. Chapter 7 talks about, we're not going to go over it, but chapter 7 talks about Jesus being a priest by the order of Melchizedek. Chapter 8 then turns around and says, oh, Jesus was such a better high priest. And at the end of chapter 8, at the end of chapter 8, verse 13, he's just had a quote from Jeremiah. And after that he says, in speaking of a new covenant, talking about Jeremiah, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. I'm reading from the ESV this morning. Chapter 9, let's look at this. Now, even the first covenant, that's the old law, had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness, a place to worship, the tabernacle. For a tent, tabernacle, was prepared, the first section in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place. We would call it the Holy of Holies. Having the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold, as in was a golden urn holding manna, Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubims of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Now, why couldn't he speak in detail? Mainly because it wasn't convenient to go into all of this at this time. But we see this. Okay, that being prepared, these preparations having been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, that's the holy place, performing their ritual duties. But the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year. Let's stop here just for a second. Why did he only go once a year? Lest he die. That was what he was told. Remember, Nadab and Abihu, do it the way I say it. And he but once a year, and not without blood, which he offers for himself and the unintentional sins of the people. Now, if you remember when we studied the sacrifices, it talked about the unintentional sins were what the sacrifices were for. Some versions say error, ignorance. What happened if somebody sinned intentionally under the old law? Okay, look over to Numbers chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15. We'll start in verse 27. If one person sins unintentionally, he shall offer a female goat, a year old, for a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement before the Lord for the person who makes a mistake when he sins unintentionally, to make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is a native among the people of Israel, and for the stranger who sojourns among them. But the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he is a native or a sojourner, reviles the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from among his people, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment. That person shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. Hey, the ability to be forgiven is taken away. You know, sometimes we today think, how often do we sin intentionally? Do you think of any verses in the New Testament that talk about something of this nature? Does that ring any bells to you? How about Hebrews 10:26, which we'll get to in just a little bit? For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. You know, we often think about the old law and the new law, and we sometimes think, it would say God doesn't change, but he changed. You know, he really doesn't change. This is showing us how much like the old law in some cases the new law is. So yes, even the intentional sins of the Old Testament were not forgiven, is a way of putting it. But we continue. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places, remember this term, holy places. We'll get to that again in a minute. But the way into the holy place is not yet open as long as the first section is still standing. Now, people have different opinions about this, but specifically speaking, you have the holy place and the holy of holies, and people think that, okay, we have this section, and as long as it's saying that, you know, the way is not open into the holy place yet. But it's also kind of looking at it from the standpoint of we have this tabernacle, the way into the holy place is not open yet. Yes, ma'am. He was cut off. Now, it's possible that at the day of at the year of Jubilee, that was righted. I don't know for sure. But it's scary when we think about how serious it is. And that's the point I'm trying to make is... Well, and that's the point. That's right. Under the old law, he said, if you do it with a high hand, if you say, that's God says that I'm going to do this, you're out of the people. You're out of the chosen nation. So yes, it's the sacrifices did things, but only, once again, only for the unintentional. It doesn't say the sacrifices were for the intentional sins anywhere. So yeah, that's important for us to understand. It's a little scary. Yes, sir. Yeah, if you look at it from the New Testament, when he says, you know, there's no more sacrifice for sin. If you know what's right and choose to go away, there's not going to be another sacrifice.
What's really helped me understand it is like in the context of like a toddler, you know the difference when a toddler, you know, accidentally, you know, spills the milk or something like that. They're just being careless and, you know, they're focused on food or whatever. And then you can tell them not to spill their milk and they go, they shut it off. There's a difference there.
There's a rebellion.
Yes, and so there's a little bit, there's a lot of debate on what qualifies as unintentional sin.
Yes.
And stuff like that. But that's kind of helped me put when you like look at this is the line God has told me, you know, not to cross. This is what I should not do. This is what I should do, and I'm not doing it. And I say, no, I want to go do this. That's where it's high.
Right. That's a good example. And so yes, it's not saying that, I don't know that there wasn't a way for them to come back, but I haven't seen it drawn out. Let me put it that way. So what he's saying in verse 8 and 9 is okay, as long as this old law is here, as long as this old tabernacle is here, we don't have a way. The way is not open into the holy place. We'll see what the holy place is in a few minutes. Verse 9, when it's talking about the tabernacle, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts, sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. Wait a minute. Perfect the conscience. That's an interesting phrase. So the children of Israel could offer these sacrifices, but they're out here in the wilderness with God, and they're going, Contrast that with us, we shouldn't have that problem with the conscience. And we'll see why. But these laws deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. Time of Reformation most likely is to the time of Christ, because in the next verse talks about Christ's coming. Some people do say that it's the Day of Atonement, but I think more in context it's more verse 11. But when Christ appeared as high priest of the good things that have come, some versions say the good things that are to come, some things that say have come. It's an aorist tense Greek verb. It really kind of doesn't have a past or a present. It's saying it's coming. Whether it's already come, has come, I stand in this position because of this, and it will be because of that. Then, through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. What's he talking about? What is that place? Not of this creation. Not earthly, heavenly. Heavenly. So I am in chapter 9 of Hebrews, and that was verse 11. Not made with hands, not of this creation. He entered once for all into the holy places. Here's that term again. Not by means of bloods of bulls and goats and calves, but by the means of his own blood. We understand that. Thus securing an eternal redemption. Where did he enter into that holy place? Where did he go? To the right hand of God. So now we see this holy place he's talking about isn't the Holy of Holies, but heaven. Oh, that eternal redemption is pretty nice too. For if the blood of the bulls, blood of goats and bulls, and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of heifer sanctify for purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, how much more will it purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? You know, that's just one of these statements. Wow. There's several of those in here, by the way. But he's saying, wait a minute. If the bloods and bulls and goats could purify the holy things of God, how much will the blood of Christ purify our conscience and allow us to forget the old works? Many think this refers specifically to the old law, but the old works, and serve God. That's the purpose here. Let's keep going, because I'm going to run out of time already, I can tell. Therefore, he is the mediator, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. Okay. First covenant. Sins committed under the first covenant. Who committed sins under the first covenant? Have we committed sins under the first covenant? No. He's saying Christ is having those sins forgiven. Even. It's going backwards here. That's a kind of a summary statement. Even under the New Testament, they may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where will or testament is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not enforced as long as the one who made it is alive. We understand that. That fits with our culture perfectly. I'm not going to say any more about that. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool, we've talked about this, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the brook itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you. So he's talking to people of a Hebrew background. They understood this. Blood was what tied it all together. Blood was the important part here. That was what sealed the covenant, the death of Christ. And in the same way, he sprinkled with blood both the tent and all the vessels in worship. We've actually gone over that. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. Are you starting to see the comparison between the Old Testament and the New Testament? How this ties together? Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things, the Old Testament, that was a shadow of the things to come, the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. In other words, the heavenly things were cleansed with even a better sacrifice, with the sacrifice of Christ, with Christ's blood. So he's saying, it's so much better. Why would you turn around and go back to the old law when this is so much better? For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which such are copies of true things, but into heaven itself, holy place, heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters into holy places every year with the blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly. Christ would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. This is such, to me, when you're studying the old law and you read this, this is just like, oh, this brings it all together. And he summarized this in verse 27. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. You say, he's already dealt with sin. Death has been overcome. When he comes again, he's coming to take his own, to take those who are not intentionally sinning, to take those that are doing his will, as we studied last night, that love him. So these things are all tying together. Chapter 10, this is where I really wanted to get to today. For since the For since the law was but a shadow of good things to come, instead of the true form of the realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to have been offered? The argument here is simple. If the sacrifices of bulls and goats had worked, why would you keep offering them? The point is, Christ's sacrifice worked. It cleanses sin. That's all it takes. Since the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sin. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sin every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bull and goats to take away sin. I don't know how you can describe this other without getting a tingle almost. It's like you see this great plan coming together. You see God's purposes being set up to help the children of Israel, but also to bring them to Christ and for us to be able to understand it all. Uh-huh. Right. Hebrews is such a good commentary on Leviticus, on the old law. It really, really helps. The next few verses, and I'm running out of time, so we're not going to read this consequence. Christ came into the world and he said, hey, sacrifices isn't what God wants. He's quoting an Old Testament. He said, but I am doing your will. I am offering myself. And then in verse 8, when he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offering and burnt offerings and sin offerings, these are offered according to the law. Then he had added, behold, I have come to do your will. Christ came to do the will of God. Christ is God. That always gets my mind in a knot. Behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And that will we have been sanctified, and by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. We need to take our redemption seriously. Verse 11, and every priest, remember we're priests today, and every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, the priest under the old law, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all times a single sacrifice for sin, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. I keep saying, wow, Christ made the sacrifice that for all times cleanses those. Sins are forgiven for those that are being sanctified. I don't have to ask you how people are sanctified today. How are people set apart? They decide they're going to follow Christ, and they obey him by following his commandments. In one sense, you could say baptism, because it's where we come in contact with the blood of Christ. And the Holy Spirit also bears witness to us. For after saying, and this is Jeremiah, I believe, this is the covenant I will make with them after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws on their hearts and write them on their minds. Then he adds, I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. Where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin. This should kind of tie us up together a little bit and understand, okay, under the old law, he sent the sins out of the camp with a scapegoat. Under the new law, Jesus took the sins and said, I'm going to pay for them. So anyone who follows him, who does his will, who loves him, as we studied last night, is being sanctified by that blood. And where there's forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter into the holy places by the blood of Christ. Wait a minute, where is the holy places? God's presence. Since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way he has opened up to us. Remember the curtain being torn when he was crucified? That he has opened to us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. I've always looked at that, and so many people get twisted around with that phrase, our hearts sprinkled, and they get sprinkling in baptism. It's referring back to the Old Testament. He's saying, hey, our hearts have been sprinkled just like the holy things of God were sprinkled in the Old Testament. He's drawing a picture here for us to see, hey, we can draw near to God because we've been purified. We can go into his presence, not once a year, but every day, every step we take, because he's in us. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. People have argued for years about what the day was, whether it was Sunday, whether it was the end of the world, the day of judgment. He's saying this is the most important day. He's using language they understand. It's a comparison. Yeah, it's a visualization tool. Right. So yeah, it's a comparison to bring those together because they understood the sprinkling under the Old Testament, and he's making an image of it, saying it's not physical. This is the sprinkling of your heart. This is not a physical sprinkling. This is a purification. Where was I? Oh, verse 25. The day. Okay, so the Hebrews understood the day as the day of atonement. That's what they understood. That's the day that everything came together. That's the day the sins went out of the camp. So when we see the day approaching, what are we looking for? What are we looking forward to? Or maybe I should say, what should we be looking forward to? What? The day when Christ comes again. We should be looking forward to that day, that great and glorious day when every knee shall bow. And we're supposed to be encouraging one another. Okay, let's do verse 26. Well, we'll do the next little bit real quick. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries, which if we continue that way, we are one of the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy. Hear that again. Anyone that set aside the law of Moses, high hand sin. Anyone that set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? If that doesn't make your knees shake a little, you need to read it again. For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So let's turn around and put this back into Leviticus for a minute. Here are the Hebrews. They are at the end of the Day of Atonement. They have humbled themselves. They have done what God has said. The sins are out of the camp. Do you think there was any rejoicing? Do you think there was relief? I don't think it was a day like any other day. And then as we go on, continue to study Leviticus, we will come to the day of Jubilee. And once again, we're going to see this wonderful comparison. Thank you for your attention and comments this morning.